Hi guys, this is Hero. How's everyone doing today? Ajibadi Kimcho ad sub keso. Today I'm going over the negative part of Mercury, right? Or the negative aspect of Mercury that people do not talk about nearly enough, right? And that is the fact that it can, along with it being a material benefit, which is completely true, it can bring you a lot of frustration. Okay? If you look at the houses, right? Or the signs, Mercury owns 3 and 6. But if you convert those numbers to houses, right, because the signs and houses have a lot of parallel, 3 and 6 represent a lot of frustration. Okay? If you didn't know, the worst houses in general, in the whole system, the Vedic system, the first two by far are 12 and 8 in no particular order. You can decide which one's first. But the next two worst are clearly the next one is 6, and then the next one is 3. Okay? In general, like I said. Okay? Now, Mercury, from a sign perspective, owning 2 out of the 4 top ones, it should be no surprise, right? But like I said, a lot of people get caught up in the material aspect of Mercury, which, like I said, it can give you stuff, right? What does 3 and 6 represent, right? 6, its main place represents overthinking, right? In order to get what you want, you need to be able to think properly, okay? And the third has to do with efforts, right? Particularly in this video, I will emphasize putting in over efforts, like being a tryhard, right? But that one's a little bit subject to interpretation, which is also why the third house is not considered like an official gustan. Okay, but just looking at 3 and 6, right? Let's just focus on overthinking and putting in too much efforts, right? Like kind of like being a tryhard. Okay, but anywhere along this video, you can use the opposite concept to basically represent not trying at all at anything. Okay, but now if you look at anybody who's overthinking too much or being a tryhard, right? Efforts and thinking are required for mostly any sort of success in life. Okay. But like I said, anybody who's doing these two a lot, do they really seem like any happy people in your life? No, right? Even though they can give you exactly what your ego wants, right? Your Mercury is always the closest planet to the sun, right? Your sun represents your identity, your identification, right? So any sort of ego pleasure or whatever ego desires, the sun is the source, but the Mercury is like, your sun's right-hand man. Okay? So your Mercury, anything it's doing, right? It can give you a lot, but it's constantly feeding your ego, right? And feeding your ego is like kind of like pouring water into a cup that has a hole at the bottom, right? It's never going to get filled up. Even if you suddenly dump a lot at one time, it appears full. It's going to, be empty at some point, right? So you have to understand this about Mercury, right? It's overthinking and its ability to put in a lot of efforts. It's never actually truly going to make you happy, although it can give you material success. Okay, very high amount of material success. Problem. I'd probably say out of any of them, it can give you the most amount of material success, even more than Venus to an extent, especially when it comes to things. Okay, see, if you look at Venus, it also orbits the sun, but it's not as close, right? So it has the ability to kind of give you the desires and stuff like that, but kind of keep its distance in a much more grounded way, okay, for the most part, okay? Mercury's not able to do that, okay? Now, Mercury, right? See, anybody that's overthinking a lot or putting in a lot of efforts, what advice would you give to those people, right? It's to basically just chill out, relax, right? Most likely you don't really want to be too close to those people just because they kind of giving you like a very hard energy and things like that. It's not a very loose and relaxed energy, right? This is also why, Venus gets debilitated in Mercury's main sign of Virgo, right? When it comes to anything Venus related, it's not going to give you as much pleasure as you think, right? Because no matter what happens, it's never going to be enough, right? Also, another thing to consider, Mercury is the opposite signs of Jupiter, right? 3 is opposite of 9 and 6 is opposite of 12. This is not, a mistake, okay? The reason why this is, see, Mercury represents the rational intelligence. Jupiter represents the more spiritual wisdom and things like that. So although Jupiter, it's not as strong of a material benefit as Mercury, from an actual pure like intelligence standpoint, it actually represents true wisdom and true spiritual knowledge and things like that. Versus Mercury, it's just your rational thinking. Now, so there's a few points that we can make here, right? One is that if you overindulge, which Mercury can give that tendency to overindulge in rational intelligence, your spiritual journey or knowledge, whatever you want to coin it, it can be disrupted, which is obviously not good, okay? This is why, its signs are opposite of Jupiter's, right? But that's not to say, just before I move on, that rational intelligence is not important for spiritual knowledge or religious, wisdom or any of that kind of stuff, right? There's a reason why, yes, Mercury signs are opposite of Jupiter's, but I just made a video on this sometime recently. I think it was the 4th and 10th house video, where I talked about this. Each opposite signs have a flow, right? For example, the 3rd and the 9th house, your learning from the 9th house is always being affected by your efforts from the 3rd house, and your efforts from the 3rd house is always being affected by your learnings, which came from the 9th house, right? So there's always this system here. This is why anybody who's spiritual or religious in some way, there needs to be some kind of rational basis going on here, right? And you need to be able to think and put in the efforts in the right places, right? So just that's necessary for any sort of grounded religious or spiritual behaviors or thoughts that you might have, right? So that's very important. But just in a sense, Mercury, in a nutshell, just to possibly wrap this up or just at least summarize till now what was going on. Mercury, it's opposite of your Jupiter, right? Or its signs are opposite of your Jupiter, which means that, overindulging in rational intelligence or things like that, it can kind of almost take away from or disrupt your spiritual journey, right? Another thing is that it's always so close to the ego, right? It's signs, literally, its main sign comes after the sun, and its secondary sign comes right before the moon. Okay, so it has a lot to do with your thoughts and emotions and kind of feeding onto those. Okay, so those in general are going to give you a lot of suffering, right? So its agenda, in a sense, is feeding into a lot of sufferings in the long term. Okay, and third, a lot of the things that we like, which are Venus related, right? When it comes to enjoyment, your enjoyment is hampered when it comes to very strong Mercury related things. Okay, it's not about a factor of what actually happens or what you actually get. It's your mindset when you get those things, right? Mercury can make it so that whatever you get is not good enough, right? Or whatever you get, you need more, things like that. Okay, so I think that's it for this video. I'm like a little over 8 minutes. I think this is appropriate. If you have any questions or comments, as usual, you can feel free to let me know. And until next time, I'll talk to everyone later. Thank you all very, very much for watching.